In some leadership roles, you can't rely on hierarchy. All you have are your relationships. So, in that situation, how do you build influence that is so deeply rooted it can move a whole sector forwards? In this episode, I'm joined by Guy Pascoe to explore what it takes to lead at sector level, where there's no formal authority, only influence, alignment, and trust. Welcome to the Independent School Podcast with me, Juliet Corbett. I'm a trusted advisor, executive coach and strategist, working with accomplished leaders who are navigating complex challenges, the kind that can feel like a tangled ball of string, confusing, frustrating, and hard to unpick. In this new series, I bring you real-world conversations with principals, heads, and CEOs of independent and international schools. Together, we explore problem-solving in uncertainty, staying strategic amidst the daily bustle of leadership, and building high-performing teams. Today, I'm joined by Guy Pascoe, Chief Executive of Independent Schools of New Zealand, ISNZ, the national body representing independent schools across the country. If you've listened to my recent conversations with Julie Robinson in the UK and Graham Catt in Australia, you'll know I've been exploring what sector leadership looks like at a national level. Guy leads the equivalent organisation in New Zealand, working at the intersection of schools, government and public policy. Guy brings experience across education, business and strategy. He was pivotal in establishing Cordon Bleu New Zealand, has led sector-wide education projects and has held senior roles across universities, private training establishments and schools, including as International Director at Scots College. In this conversation, we explore what school leaders can learn from sector leadership, where authority is earned through influence. We discuss the difference between authority and influence, why strategy is often about disciplined focus rather than expansion, and how strong relationships built over time can carry more weight than hierarchical command. So, let's jump into my conversation with Guy Pascoe. Hello, Guy, and welcome to the Independent School Podcast. Fantastic to have you with us here today.
Thanks, Juliet. It was a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So, tell us a little bit about how you ended up committing a career to education. What's the root of your passion for this sector?
Sure. Well, I guess I started off my career as a teacher, and the reason I went into teaching initially was I just really loved or I thought I would really love the variety that came with the job. I was an outdoor education and science teacher. I loved being in the outdoors and being able to kind of work with young people in that setting. And so I taught for about 10 years in a variety of different settings. And then after about 10 years, I suddenly woke up one day and thought, I'm sick of being in front of the classroom. I've kind of lost the passion, but I still wanted to stay connected to the industry. So I then pivoted and worked in international education for about 15 years. And my last role in international education was at an independent school. And that's where I learnt or came to know about this organisation that I'm now working for. So that's the condensed version of my journey.
Yeah. So at some point, the passion was the teaching, and then it morphed into an understanding of the bigger impact that it was having without the need to actually be the one inclined to the classroom.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly how it was. I was still deeply passionate about the importance of education and the the massive impact that teachers can have on children's lives, and but I became more interested, I guess, in the kind of the sort of the systems and that kind of thing, and realized that I was no longer the person to be standing in front of the classroom.
Yeah. So what attracted you to work for ISNZ then, to have that kind of overview role of the sector?
Well, one of my prior roles had been working for an organisation that was promoting Wellington as a destination for international students, Wellington City, where I'm based. And that was working with schools and universities and polytechnics. And so it was kind of a pseudo membership association. And through that role, I realized that actually I really enjoy working with a wide variety of different organizations. And, you know, this it's a real privilege to be able to look across everyone and they all, with this disparate group of sometimes competing organizations. But
Mm.
it's yeah, I realized that I actually really enjoy the kind of the challenge of that. It can be a little bit like herding cats, but I discovered it was something I have a kind of a passion for. And so when this
Mm.
role came up, as I said, I was already working in an independent school, so it was a sector that I was kind of had become passionate about. And for me, it was just a dream opportunity.
Yeah. And it is a really quite diverse sector, isn't it? Some of the schools are really quite small, rural. There are some specialist schools, as well as what we might see as a more kind of a scale, economies of scale model
Yeah,
that some
that's right.
schools are
So
using.
across our membership, which is about 50 schools, we our smallest member school has 15 students, and our largest member school has 2,500 students.
Mm. So it's a big
And
range.
yeah, a huge range. Of course, the issues that they are dealing with are very, very different.
Mm.
Um, but of course, there are some common issues as well, given that they're all independent schools. So, and within those schools, we have schools that are specifically catered to students with high learning needs. We have faith-based schools, we have Christian schools, we have kind of green schools. There's a very wide range, and again, that's a real privilege, I think, to be able to work with such a
Mm.
diverse group of schools,
Yeah.
all with their different curricula and educational philosophies and pedagogies and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. And of course, the finances and the funding that sits underneath each of those models is also different. You have a really interesting combination of some government support, but then there's also GST or VAT,
Yeah,
sales tax added. So yeah, tell us a little bit about that. Just kind of high level, give us a sense.
yeah, sure. So independent schools in New Zealand are funded under a fixed appropriation. Um, and so basically, there's a fixed amount. It's around about $40 million in New Zealand. And then that is spread across the schools on a per student basis with some scaling depending on whether you are a primary school or a secondary school. So a primary school student at the moment might attract around 900 New Zealand dollars a year in government funding, and a secondary school student about 1,800 New Zealand dollars a year in government funding. Um, so, which is not very much at all,
Mhm.
but it's more than what you get in the UK.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and so schools are largely dependent, however, on tuition fees from parents. And in New Zealand, we don't have that kind of long history or culture of philanthropy and that kind of thing with our schools as well. So while schools are looking for, philanthropic donations and foundations, really it's parents who are, um, you know, helping our
Hmm.
schools to survive. And
Hmm.
yes, in New Zealand, parents pay GST on tuition. They have done since GST was introduced in New Zealand many years ago, so it hasn't come as a kind of a shock to us like the
Hmm.
VAT has in the UK. That GST that we pay, that our parents pay, is about twice what our sector receives in funding from the government. So there's quite a strong argument that we make with government. And in fact, our sector is a net contributor to um, you know, to the New Zealand economy.
Hmm.
And the notion that some people have that every dollar you spend in an independent school is a dollar that you're taking away from a state school is just simply um, categorically not true. So
Yeah.
that's a big advocacy
Yeah.
function that we play as well.
Yeah. It's interesting that there was a previous conversation that on the podcast I had with Graham Catt, who's the your equivalent in Australia, and then of course with Julie Robinson, the equivalent
Yes.
CEO of the Peak Body here in the UK. And it is really interesting that the differences in the way the sectors have evolved over time, and then what becomes a norm within one country, one economy, one political system, is quite different to what's become a norm in others. And I think one of the biggest things that surprised me when I moved across to Australia to work in the sector was that any funding comes from government into a
Yes.
school per pupil, of any type. And although obviously in the UK we're now adapting to a new VAT
Yes.
framework where parents are needing to pay VAT on school fees, there are differences between each nation. Each system is quite different to some extent.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's and I we meet as we have a kind of a group of the chief executives from the independent school organizations around the world, and you have very different funding mechanisms across
Yeah.
those different entities, and of course that plays out in the number of students. So in New Zealand, about 4% of students are educated in independent schools,
Hmm.
and it's hovered around that for many years, that
Mm.
4% mark. But you look across to Australia, and it's considerably more than that. But they have a very
Yeah, it's
different
about seven. Yeah, about
funding model.
7% here in the UK,
Mm.
fairly standard at that level. So the other thing that was really striking to me that feels a little bit different, it feels like a side issue, but actually I think it becomes quite an important issue that's different in New Zealand is there's a you've mentioned to me before that there's more flow in teaching staff or staff will stop perhaps between the state sector and the independent sector. And I wonder whether that makes it feel different. Does that make it feel less like two separate sectors, state and independent? Or does it still play out that it feels very much like two very separate sectors?
Yeah, that's a really good question because for sure in New Zealand there is a lot more movement between independent and state, and not just at teacher levels, but also in leadership,
Hmm.
school leadership as well. You know, we just don't have that many independent schools in New Zealand. So
Hmm.
if you are a DP or an AP and you're looking for that next step up to headship, and you're in an independent school, there's not many jobs that come up. And
Yeah.
so it would be quite normal for someone to step out into the state system and
Hmm.
take a principalship role there and then move back into the independent sector at some
Hmm.
other time. So there is definitely a lot more, um, well, I get the impression there's a lot more fluidity than there is in countries like the UK, where people seem to be a little bit more one system or
Mm.
another. But
Mm.
does that play out in the kind of we're all you know a sort of a happy family and everything? I'm not sure. There are still some pretty deeply entrenched views about independent schools in New Zealand, and similar to what you have in the UK.
Mhm.
And so that's um, and I guess maybe it doesn't exist as much between people who work in the system, so with teachers or principals, but there's certainly a public perception around independent schools just being very wealthy and elite that we really have to work hard to try and challenge.
Yeah, I think that's probably true across the world. Well, I guess it's true in
Yeah.
any sector. There are assumptions made about
Yeah.
you, and on the inside, they're not true.
Yes.
And that's true in many other sectors as well.
Yeah.
But certainly within the independent school
Yeah.
sector, it feels quite acute at times. The
Yeah.
contrast between how it
Mm.
feels inside the
Yeah.
sector and how it's sometimes perceived from
Yeah.
outside.
But I have to
Um,
say but that movement I think is a real strength of New Zealand, and I think it's
mm,
it's because there are some state schools that are doing amazing things and some independent schools that are doing amazing things, and to have that cross-pollination of ideas I think is really
yeah,
critical.
yeah, absolutely. So you've got a big job on your hands, but a small team. How many of you actually, in terms of staff members, how many do you have
So
at
there's
ISNZ?
five of us,
Okay.
but in terms of full-time equivalent staff, it's 3.8 or something like that. So yes, we
Yeah.
are we're a small team with big ambitions. That's how I like
Yeah.
to put it.
Small but mighty, some might say. I
Small
love
but
it.
mighty. Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
that's
Or
right.
small and mighty. Maybe that's better.
Yeah.
Um, so, so there could be lots of different areas that you're getting involved with as the association representing the sector. There's the advocacy and representation. There's the kind of training and CPD element. How do you as a team decide where to focus your energy in terms of setting that strategic direction for yourselves, but also for the sector that you're representing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I guess we have the strategy is set by my board, you know, in conjunction with me. And, you know, we spend a lot of time when I started in this role setting that strategy, and we review it on a reasonably regular basis. But as an outcome of that, you know, we have 4 pretty clear strategic priorities, and you've just touched on what those are. So, for example, representation, um, inspiration, which is our professional development and advice and guidance, connection, so making sure that we are a well connected collegial network of schools, and then sustainability. And that's financial sustainability as well as environmental sustainability for the organization. So having that a really clear strategy that I lean very heavily on helps to keep us tight and focused. And it's as much about being able to say no as it is about being able to say yes. You know, so although they're not kind of written down anywhere in my head, I have some pretty clear strategic boundaries. And if I don't think something fits in to what we are trying to do, then, you know, we have to say no. And being a small team can make that easier to say no as well, because people understand that we have limited capacity. So we have to be very selective about what we're working on.
Yeah, that strategy in its best is as a lens to what to say no to. I've said that many times before, actually, with clients and on this podcast, that actually one of the best strengths of having a strategy that's been agreed and written down somewhere is it gives you the best excuse to say no to the distractions that are inevitably going to occur.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you say, I think there is a strength in the fact that you are a small team in that, and we can overlook that sometimes. I think there is a strength in that you have to be focused. So it's like the conditions force you to say no to things that are distractions.
Yeah, that's right. And we have, like, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we would love to be able to do, but it's not just the you know, the team, it's also the budget constraints and that kind of thing. You know, our schools have, despite what many people think, are not swimming in cash. And so we have to be in a thing that we're putting together for the sector. You know, we've got to be very cognizant of budgets for schools and that kind of thing as well. We don't have it. We certainly don't have deep pockets, so that helps keep us focused also.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that has really shone out in the interviews I've been doing for the podcast recently has been some of the lessons that are absolutely sector, they're not sector specific leadership tips or strategies or approaches. They're actually at the core of really good leadership, full stop. And so what you're saying actually would be equally applicable in other sectors, and in fact, equally applicable with some adaptation to different team sizes or organization sizes. There are some hard truths: the ability to say no, the ability to be really clear what your objectives are, and to then stay focused on that.
And I guess another question I ask myself when we're looking at what we'll do is that, is this going to add value for our members or not? And you know, and you have to accept that there will be some things that it might not add value in the same way for all members. So it's important to take a sector-wide view as well. And that can be, I guess that can be a difficult conversation sometimes with a school who feels really passionately that ISNZ should be doing this, but then when I'm talking to other schools, they might have a different view. So balancing that can be tricky.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hate to say it, but that's what you get paid for, to be a leader, is to hear all the different stakeholder points of view, different departments' points of view, different, you know, all those different voices. And then it's needing to be the one that listens to lots of opinions, but is the one who makes the final call.
Correct.
Which actually brings me to our next topic I want to talk about, which is that in the sector leadership role that you don't have hierarchical authority over the principals of the school. I can see a big head shaking there. It's quite clear. So the way that you do this role is all through influence, encouragement, herding cats to some extent, but it is that really core element of influence rather than hierarchical authority, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely it is. I mean, we're not a regulatory body.
Mm-hmm.
Independent schools are free to do what they want to do. Um, so having that influence is really a key part of the role and for
Mm.
us as an organization. And I guess sitting underneath that is relationships and having really strong relationships with our schools and the key decision makers in our schools. And I suppose that's one of the advantages of being a relatively small organization where we just have 50 members. It's not too difficult for me to have a personal or an individual relationship with all of those people. But I do invest a lot of time in trying to build that relationship in, visiting heads or boards at their schools. I try to make sure that I get around every school at least on a 2 year cycle, and I kind of see that as it's having that really strong foundation means that if something does go wrong or a challenge does come up, then it's very easy for me just to pick up the phone and talk through it.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think are the key elements of that strong relationship? So obviously there's the classics for any relationship. There's trust, there's getting to know someone as a
Mm.
human being, as well as the fact that they have a particular job title. But there's something really important around that feeling of it being a peer relationship as well. Like there
Mm.
isn't a hierarchy between you and the principals. I'm thinking
No,
you're meeting as peers.
correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's lis listening and making the principles and hearing. I guess there's a difference, isn't there? But
Yeah.
really,
Yeah.
really hearing what people are saying, and in a really and with no judgment as well, because we have schools that have vastly different philosophies, and but they're all serving their community in a different way, and yeah, just in an eagerness to actually learn and understand. And I think people really appreciate that, and I think that helps
Mm.
build that level of relationship.
Yeah. I love the distinction there between listening and hearing. It does make a big difference, doesn't it? There's
Yeah,
there's there's the kind of the listening because I know I need to listen so that I know
yeah,
what I'm going to say next. And then there's the listening for what's not being said. What am I seeing in the body language that doesn't quite connect with the words they're
yeah,
using? Or what's the next question that's going to help me understand this person or this
mm,
organization better?
yeah,
Which is a deeper way. I like your
yeah,
phrase eager to learn. It's that curiosity of tell me more, like let me understand that better, rather than listening to speak
yeah.
when it's your turn.
And I also think just building that you talked about trust before, but as with any leadership, trust and authenticity and that kind
Yeah.
of thing. When I came into the role for the first kind of 6 months or a year, which I guess is pretty normal. I had a bit of imposter syndrome and um, felt like I needed to be exactly like my predecessor. But then kind of realizing actually I can be who I am
Yeah.
and build that trust and that relationship. And I think that, puts puts you in a good position.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting. Imposter syndrome. It's one of those things which, as a label, we're made to think that we shouldn't have it, that it's a bad
Mm,
thing. But one of the ways that I've reframed it in my career is that's a good thing because I'm feeling outside my comfort zone for a bit. And
mm.
as long as it doesn't go on forever and it's not debilitating, it's like,
No.
oh, okay,
Yeah.
do that again. Okay, never mind, let's get on.
Yeah.
And then there's a sense of it can come and go, and that might be entirely normal.
Yeah.
In fact, my coach challenged me a couple of months ago and said, well, if you're not feeling imposter syndrome, why not go and find somewhere where you can feel like an imposter? Because that means you're playing a big, you're stretching beyond your comfort
Yeah.
zone. You're playing a
Push it.
bigger
Yeah.
game. You're
Yeah. That's right.
growing,
And
which is
it's
interesting.
it's like you say, it was not a debilitating thing or anything, but it's
Yeah.
when you're kind of new in a role and trying to establish yourself
Yeah.
as the sector leader,
Yeah.
and and I guess given that I've never been a principal or a head of a school
Hmm.
myself,
Hmm.
but that's not what I'm here to do.
No.
I'm here to to be leading the sector,
Yeah,
not leading a
exactly.
school. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I say that as well. I've never been ahead.
yeah,
Doesn't matter. You still
yeah.
do the job that you need to do. Um, and it's really interesting as well that word authenticity. I guess it's sometimes overused a little bit, or sounds a bit corny, but there is something that we grow into, isn't there, in our leadership once we become established as a leader, that become a bit more comfortable being ourselves. You might dial up or down certain parts of our personality
Mm,
or our approach depending on who's in front of us, but it's much easier, isn't it, when we can
mm,
be authentically ourselves, and it comes
mm,
across and it develops trust
mm.
much faster as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I wonder as well whether it helps you say no to people.
Yes. Yeah. I'm sure it does. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um, and I find that people are pretty understanding. You know, they get it that we have a it's not always an easy job trying to
yeah.
uh, represent the views of um, 50 school 50 schools who all have different views.
Mm,
There is
yeah,
no one view
yeah.
apart from on funding.
Yeah, well, where a united front is helpful.
Yes.
But what that brings to mind for me actually is the wider idea around, not only is there not one right view that you're able to represent, there will always be the diversity of the views of the schools that you're representing. I think we're entering a world where there's more complexity, more uncertainty. There quite often isn't a one right answer, full stop.
Mm,
And it's about figuring out what's the next best step that we can
mm,
take, and almost designing each of those steps so that we learn more. So it may not be that we're actually taking actions that are actually solving the problem. Maybe the actions we're taking are to learn more about the problem, and eventually we'll be in a position that yes, we can now solve that problem. But I
yeah.
think a lot of what we're dealing with in leadership is, if it ever was easy, it's certainly not now.
Yeah.
I only
No,
see that getting worse.
Yep. Well, yeah, definitely challenging times, and absolutely a lot of uncertainty. And for our schools, I mean, I don't know. In New Zealand, it seems that education is becoming increasingly politicized
Yeah.
as well, and actually, in independent schools, um, I guess one of the benefits of being independent is that we're not necessarily our schools are not necessarily caught up in as much of that as what some of our state school colleagues are, where there is a
Mm.
lot of change happening in New Zealand at the moment, and independent schools have a little bit more freedom to be selective about what they need to take on or not take on. But yeah, challenging times, I think, in
Yeah.
education. Yeah,
Yeah, definitely. And I think that that might be true of quite a lot of other sectors as well. There seems to be,
yeah,
I think, as times get tough and the geopolitics becomes more uncertain, and there's more sort of things that we've taken for granted for the last 50 years to do with the way the systems work internationally, the more that starts to get questioned and starts to become more uncertain. I think that and the way that interplays with the economics of it all as
mm,
well, and the way that governments are balancing budgets and so on. Um, I think that it's going to become more politicized, in my opinion, because it becomes, as the budget gets tighter and tighter, as it may
mm,
well do internationally, that means that there will be more and more tough decisions
yeah,
that need to be made. Mm.
yeah.
So, as we wrap up our conversation, Guy, what's one thing that you'd like people to take away? What's the kind of advice maybe that you wish you'd heard when you were starting out in your career?
Do you mean my in this role or in
Either.
right? Okay, you've really put me on the spot here.
That's my job.
Um, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it sounds you know, corny, but just really sort of follow your passion. I mean, it's funny when I look back on my career, and I've still got a way to run, by the way, on my career, I
Yeah,
would
yeah,
think.
yeah.
But it, it looks like when I look back at it in reverse, you could say, oh, it's been a very kind of deliberate sort of progression to get to where you are, but it really hasn't been deliberate at all.
Mm.
It's just been me, um, you know, taking opportunities and following my interests, and you never know quite. And I've ended up here, and
Yeah.
yeah. So looking back, it looks like it's been a very planned, natural progression, but it really hasn't been at all. It's been
Mm.
a series of random decisions and opportunities, and taking those opportunities. And yeah, so but I feel incredibly privileged to be where I am. That's for sure.
Yeah. It's true for me as well. I think that's really important for people to hear. You can create a narrative looking back if you need
Yes.
to. That's fine, but that doesn't mean that it was a planned narrative in advance. I always
Yeah.
remember running some career sessions with the Cambridge University students that I was working with when I was fundraising back in the university, and they were really, really focused on the fact they needed a plan. They needed a career plan. And I kept
Mm.
telling them, like, go and find a job that interests you, and the next step will unfold as you go. And
Yes.
I think it was, some of them found that quite scary, but a lot of them found that quite reassuring, that actually
Yeah.
most of us don't plan this stuff out. I certainly didn't
No.
plan it out. And you can still have a
No.
very fulfilling career
Absolutely.
without having
Yeah.
the plan.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Guy, for your time on the Independent School podcast today. It's been fantastic to have you with us.
Thanks, Juliet. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Independent School podcast. If you found today's conversation valuable, I invite you to join my email list and hear more of my fresh thinking on leading strategically through complexity and uncertainty. Visit www.consultjuliet.co.uk/sign up. Remember, the biggest challenges you face are rarely solved by working harder. They're solved by thinking differently, with the right trusted advisor in your corner. While I work with leaders across many sectors, my heart and more than 2 decades of experience remain deeply rooted in education. If you're ready to turn complexity into progress, sharpen your focus, and lead a happier, higher performing team, I'd love to start a conversation about how we could work together. Just reach out anytime. And don't forget, the clearest insights often appear when you gift yourself a moment to slow down and let your best thinking surface.